everyone. I'm Ishika.
And I'm Akshay.
The thing about wildlife is anyone can fall in love with it through science, photography, literature, or innocent observation.
Sharing their love today is Krishnapriya Tamma, an ecologist and faculty member at Azim Premji University with a particularly infectious strain of scientific curiosity. So, welcome to Think About Wildlife. Today we will be speaking with Dr. Krishnapriya Tamma, or Priya as we are referring to her today. So, Priya is an ecologist with an interest in tropical forest diversity, dynamics, and biogeography. She did a PhD on the biogeography and macroecology of small mammals in the Indian subcontinent, especially the Himalayas. Her postdoctoral work on African tropical forest savanna dynamics. As part of her long term research, she is interested in understanding forest recovery in Northeast India and how human activity influences recovery. Besides research, Priya has been involved actively in organizing a student conservation conference, as well as trying to improve inclusivity in her field through her blogs and her engagement with various stakeholders in this field. So it's an honor and pleasure to have you with us on our podcast. Welcome to the Thing About Wildlife, Priya.
Thank you, Akshay. Thanks, Ishika, for having me here.
So we can dive right in. I think we're going to start off with a very simple question about how you found yourself here. And, we were reflecting as we were thinking of all the things we wanted to talk to you about, that, it's such a phenomenon in our field to see engineers turning towards wildlife and ecology. And Akshay, of course, is another example. So I'm the only non-engineer on the on this call today. Did you always want to be, a biotechnologist, and then eventually, turn into something more like in our field? How do you think this comes to be?
Actually, I wish I had a straightforward answer for this question, and I really haven't had time to sit down and think about this, but I think it was part serendipity and part interest. I think I've always been interested in many things as a young adult. So when I finished my 12th, I think I was interested in so many things that I did many things. So I started law college while also applying for vet school and for engineering, because I was not entirely sure which was the one that really, I was willing to try out anything because um, it kind of fit what I thought I wanted to be in life at that time. I guess the common theme in all my decisions has always been that, within quotes, I wanted to do something good for society. Yeah. And so I guess when I started law, I thought I'll be an environmental lawyer. When I applied for vet school, I thought, there I'll go and save all the animals. So I guess that was there. But I think eventually I settled on engineering because I assumed, biology was my interest, and I had got the seat in biotechnology, and I thought I liked engineering. I did enjoy bits of it, but I think halfway through it, I kind of recognized that it wasn't as fulfilling as I thought it might be for me. And also at that time, I was reading books that were beyond what I was learning in engineering, right? Engineering also happens to suffer specifically from this lack of diversity in what you learn, right? There's no humanities, there's no social sciences, and especially in India, if you do science, um, even right from your high school, there's very little that you learn about science and society, or the other aspects of science. That science is embedded within how you do work within the society, right? So since you don't learn that, I don't know, maybe I felt a little bit like this didn't make sense to me. So I started reading a lot more, and I remember reading a couple of books. I think I read Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins, and maybe something about, I think, some human evolution and something about societies or something like that. And I started realizing that those were really far more interesting than what I was doing at that time. And also, I've always been an observant person. So I think I've always observed the birds around my house or the plants that grew and things. So I guess that was also the time when I spent more time observing, while I was reading, while I was observing. And I realized that I do indeed, I enjoyed thinking about animals and plants, but from a very scientific perspective. I don't think I was not someone who went on treks. I didn't come from a family who went on treks or anything like that. So my exposure to nature was just based on what I saw around my house, growing up in a city like Bangalore. And I guess at some point, it was just a decision I took, right? So I was like, this is it. So I think maybe in my second or third year of engineering, I was like, where can I do wildlife biology? So that's how I guess I stumbled into it in a way. And mostly driven by scientific curiosity. Like I was interested in knowing why is it that these plants exist here or these animals exist here, more than I guess this deep-seated experience of nature, which I didn't have at that point. Not as much, at least. Yeah.
Wow, that's very relatable yet very different, but also relatable. So, I'm just curious. Do you have a theory why this is so about what is so repulsive about engineering in some you did say there's something interesting about it, right? Because there are so many of them from the engineering who end up not just in ecology, environment science, but in humanities and all of that.
I think it is to do with the way these subjects are taught to us, right? Like I was saying, I feel, I mean, I may be completely wrong, but this is my reflection of it. I feel like for me, I mean, taking my own case, you learn, of course, social science or whatever in school, but that really is just not as deep or not as well threshed out that you understand your role as a citizen in the society. And then when you choose science, science is always in our country projected as this better thing to do, or a superior subject to take or whatever. And I guess once you finish your 10th, when you do your 11th and 12th, the focus is so much about the science, you just don't learn any other subject, right? So I have a feeling that for people, especially those who are, I guess, empathetic enough, who can see around and feel like this is weird because what I'm learning, kind of doesn't show me what's happening in the rest of the society. I don't know, maybe that discordance kind of is felt more deeply. So they feel maybe this, that I'm learning all these things, but it seems like none of this actually makes sense given the issues around me or whatever. So maybe that's why um, people choose to kind of completely switch. Maybe, I don't know. We'll have to do a survey amongst the
Yeah.
numerous engineers turned other things.
Did you do you at any point feel that you would have liked to get into the field of ecology any sooner than you did, or are you happy with the trajectory that you took?
I think I'm happy with the trajectory that I took. I'm by personality not someone who retrospectively questions my decisions too much. I think I'm happy for what I did because I feel like having done the engineering, I did gain certain skills, like quantitative skills, or we had to learn C or whatever as part of my engineering. We had to learn a lot of chemical engineering, a lot of drawing and machine development, whatever, all those things. And I think I enjoyed them. And I think although directly I can't show you how it how it improves me as an ecologist, I do think that there are certain things that I learned um, having gone through that training. So I don't regret it at all. I think it's okay. I'm happy with the way things turned out. Um, so yeah.
So I think we can move on to some. You have a very interesting blog, and I think I encourage all our listeners. I think no, it seems like you have sanitized it as well, because I remember seeing your blog 5-6 years ago, and there were some more posts which were not very professor types, but now it's yeah. Anyway, it's
No,
about
I don't think I've actively sanitized it. I think it also reflects my own change in perspective and thinking, maybe. Yeah.
okay. So it's kidding. So it's pangolinprophecies.wordpress.com. So we found a lot of interesting things to discuss out there, and one of the things you mentioned is about I think building off of how science is embedded in society. And how little of that gets spoken about, and because of that you have either people who just do the science and then don't forget about communicating it to society, or spend a lot of time like science journalists, or sometimes to the detriment of science, like say a Deepak Chopra, who would completely dissolve the science for society. So obviously there's a balance, and where do you see that balance in terms of doing the rigor of science and communicating science and opinions of scientists?
Um, I think for me, science communication is important not just because science has to be made accessible, right? Unfortunately, science everywhere in the world, and especially in India, is an ivory tower. You just look at the way our science institutes are constructed, right? There are so many gates, so many passes you have to take to enter any science institute. It's symbolic, I think, of how carefully guarded science is. And I feel like we have to break that down because there are two problems with it, right? A, it means that science is not inclusive. We have very few people coming from very few backgrounds who end up doing science, and science has this importance that is given to it in Indian society, which kind of when not having a diverse group then makes it a problem. I think apart from that, we also have to remember that science is just another thing that societies do, right? Humanities, arts, everything, they're all different things that societies engage in. And so by making science into this ivory tower, we make it into something, give it power that, I'm not saying that science isn't important, I am a scientist, but I feel like it also shouldn't be made so inaccessible that it begins to feel strange to people, right? That you either have complete blind trust and faith in it, which is also not good, and you refuse to question scientists because you think, I don't know anything about it, they must be right. So I feel like it's not good for society to have this kind of ivory tower type science practice. So I think science communication is important. It's not just a token thing that you do to say, hey, I published a paper, here is what it means. I think it's important to engage because we were lucky to do science. I am lucky to be able to do science, right? Not everybody has the privilege I have or the luck I have to kind of pursue science, which means I think since I'm engaging full time in understanding how science works, or in understanding certain phenomena, and others may not have the time to pursue those things, I should communicate it to them in a manner that they can understand it, form their own opinions, because those opinions matter, right? When we think about governance in India or whatever. So that's, I think, why I do science communication. The other thing is, I think I've always been someone who, when I read something exciting or I come across something exciting, I want to shout and shake everybody and say, hey, you know what? I learned this. So I guess writing for me and science communication for me is also a different way of doing this, engaging in this very bad habit that I have of, yeah.
I don't think that's a bad habit at all. I think we all benefit from it quite a bit.
You should ask some of my friends who, yeah, do not want to be told about every fascinating thing about every tree that we see when we go on a walk.
I think maybe in that case, we need to do a recording on a walk with you and put that out there for our listeners.
No.
Give you a new audience to share stuff with.
No, I'm happy to do it with my friends. They act enraged, but I'm sure they secretly like it.
No, so it's interesting that, you were telling us about the importance of sharing a lot of these opinions, but it's also interesting from an academic standpoint, because even there we are gradually moving to a place where we're embracing a lot of researcher bias and subjectivity, and we're starting to realize that maybe that's also important in the larger scheme of things, and you can't always be objective about things. So but like you were saying, it's still a bit in the ivory tower. So how do we know whose opinions we can trust? I mean, is this a good thing, or is this like a slippery slope?
So I think opinions is I don't know if that's the right word to use in this case, right? All of us gather a lot of experience when we do our work, right? Either be it in field or when we're looking at our data or whatever we're doing, lab work, whatever. We learn a lot of things, and not everything goes into a paper, right? They're intuitions that you have based on your experience by, say, on working on plants in the forest or something like that. And I think we should value those intuitions. We should value those opinions, or at least have space for them. An opinion doesn't make it a fact, right? I think we have to be very clear when we make our opinions known. we have to say this is my opinion, right? It doesn't mean that it is a fact. I think it's very easy maybe for some of us to differentiate between an opinion and fact because we are trained to do so, but not everybody can. So I think I think there should be space for opinions, right? For example, I might have gone to 10 conferences in the last 20 years, and I might have an opinion of how, based on my experience, my feelings about these conferences, I might feel like, you know what, in my opinion, maybe conferences are a bit, non-inclusive or something like that. I might not have hard data to show it, to prove it to you, but it is still coming from a space of experience, right? Of intuition and observing things. As long as I'm able to differentiate and explain to you that this is not a fact, but this is my opinion, I think there is value for that opinion. I think that's what I mean. I think you've read a couple of my posts where there's something about the importance of opinions, and I think that's what I mean there, especially when it comes to, like you said, scientific method may be objective, but science isn't, right? Because everybody carries biases. How much ever we think we are unbiased, we are not. We have our own biases, right? And I think because science is just another thing that is done by human beings, all the biases that human beings carry is going to be carried forward in science as well. So just because I say something is a fact and I have a paper to show it also doesn't mean that it comes from a place of absolute objectivity, right? So I guess being very clear about it helps. And I guess helping, I don't know, when we do science communication, also helping people understand the difference between all these things, right? Just because a science paper says something doesn't make it an absolute fact, right? That inference also can be biased. The way I might look at a graph, you might look at a graph, and we both might take away completely different messages from that graph, right? And in that case, whose opinion is going to matter to you, right? Even as scientists, we remain divided among many things, right? Does intermediate disturbance hypothesis, does it matter? Does it not matter? We can fight for years about this. The point, I mean, that uncertainty and sometimes the fact that evidence is hard to interpret is something maybe with experience you and I learn as scientists, but it's not something that we tell the public about it, right? We're not telling them that these things exist. So it becomes harder, I guess, when we do science communication or when they see papers or when they see articles about science. It's harder for someone who doesn't know that science can have disagreements, that sometimes it depends on what kind of data you collect, who collected the data. All of this can lead to very different interpretations. Maybe as science communicators, that's something we also have to focus on, right? So that we don't end up in this mess where anything is taken as a fact, where alternative facts seem to be more important than actual facts, where people don't know how to interpret evidence or how to use evidence to kind of question things. Yeah, so I guess opinions are important, but I guess we have to be clear about what's an opinion, what's a fact, and the role of bias, and we also have to make that clear for the public.
Yeah, those are such clearly thought out and interesting arguments. I think a lot more, especially relevant in ecology. I think where everything is so noisy and multi-causal, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. This is even more harder in the natural sciences, especially say ecology, because at the end of the day, ecological systems are complex, right? The earth is a complex system, like even if you look at it scientifically, which means that there are an enormous number of interacting components, right? How much as scientists can we study to tease apart these different components? There's so many feedback loops between them. It's impossible, right? Sometimes and a science lifetime is what, 20 years, 30 years, you're active as a scientist. How much can you get information? How much can you tease apart some phenomenon in 20 years? These are phenomena that have been happening for millions of years. They'll continue to happen for millions of years. Anything we see around us as an ecological pattern is a combination of evolutionary processes, ecological processes, biogeographic processes. How? It's impossible to be absolutely sure that this is exactly what is happening without the influence of anything else. So I think that's why it's so much harder to, I think, get people to understand ecological nuance. It's nice to say, hey, look, bird is feeding on that plant. It's nice to show people things, but to think about why or to think of these ultimate causes, I think is harder, because of the fact that we live in a complex system. So it's easy to say climate is changing. It's very hard to explain exactly how it's going to change, right? Yeah.
Yeah, this reminds me. I think I have made this a trope where you say most project timelines last before a tree starts fruiting, right? So, and at most trees outlive humans, and so most of our insights on tree plant ecology is just woody plants. Yeah.
Exactly. And such a tiny slice of what's happening in their life we have access to. I mean, if we have even that much access to it, we have such a tiny slice of it. And how, I don't know, I'm regularly astounded by how much we can say about the nature around us and how little we can say, because I don't know, I feel like yeah.
So do you think this uncertainty that you just described, this sort of scientific humility, if I can put it, is there I feel is there's more room for this in the publications that we put out? Do you agree? Because there's so much emphasis on active voice and certainty in the mechanistic approach that we tend to tease apart, that we forget this or sideline this. Do you agree? And do you see a solution for this?
I think I agree to some extent. I also, I mean, a related point I think is because it's not related directly, but I think that's another thing that adds to the problem is the scale at which publications happen. I was just reading somewhere some interview with some person who was one of the first to publish C. elegans genome or something, and he was saying how he sat and he collected data for 12 years before he published it. Can you imagine that? Right? Today, the way we do science, you need to publish, 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 publish. There's so much pressure on publishing, which means that we're not sitting with information, we're not thinking, we don't spend so much time looking at various connections. We're like, we have a story, let's publish it, right? So I think that definitely also adds to the pressure of trying to sound maybe certain, trying to sound maybe making bite-sized pieces of information so we sound more confident. Maybe I think there is scope for uncertainty even amongst ourselves, and there is. It's not like there isn't, right? It's not like all science publications are all always full of certainty. There are perspectives, there are other pieces, there are opinion pieces, perspective pieces. Journals have space for people coming in and saying, this is my perspective, this is my opinion. So I think there is space for that. It already exists, but maybe I think as a scientific community, we have to kind of maybe take a step back and say, what does it mean when you say you have to publish every year, right? What do you have enough time to think of the repercussions of what your work is saying? Yeah.
Yeah, I think one other really interesting thing which we find in your work is that it's not just that you think about these things, but you actively put it out there and you try to engage a lot of people with a lot of these discussions. And, I think that's also this is a good time to talk about your role at the Student Conference of Conservation Science, or SCCS, as, we've come to know it. And you've been such an important cog in making this happen in Bangalore for quite a few years now. And you were just mentioning earlier as well that you're trying to make some of these spaces a lot more inclusive. And, it's been such an incredible platform. And but looking back, could you share some of the lessons that you've learned in trying to put this together? What has that been like for you?
So I guess SCCS definitely is an incredible platform, right, for students in India, especially students of ecology and conservation. And I think each one of us has benefited from either attending the conference or just being associated with the conference, right? I think one of the major places where we thought SCCS could definitely improve on was inclusivity. And it's tough, right? Because it is a science conference. predominantly conducted in English. And we do know that many people coming in from universities, maybe in different states or not from, urban centers, might not be so confident about their English or whatever. And it's very hard to have remedial solutions at that stage, right? But thanks to a lot of thought that went into about how do we make, and conservation, although it's a conservation science conference, conservation is not necessarily done only by scientists, right? And even conservation scientists don't do it. They are not lone warriors who go off into the forest and save things, right? We do it because we have communities helping us, or we, working with us, or we have field collaborators or assistants, or whatever you, want to refer to them as. I would prefer calling them field collaborators, right? Because think of it, I feel like none of my work would have been done if they weren't there. What's the point? My data wouldn't have been collected if they weren't there to show me the trails or to, help me go from one camping site to another, right? They also contribute to the science. We don't acknowledge it either in our publications or in any other way. There's no space for them, right? We think of science as being done by scientists, as people who communicate the science in a formal journal or are associated with institutions. So a bunch of us kind of sat down and thought about it and said, how can we make this inclusive in a way that also allows these other players who are involved in science to also come and participate in this conference, which is why we started this thing called the pre-conference module, where we invite people who are both young students. They can be pursuing conservation as a career. They can be associated with grassroots conservation organizations. And typically we invite people from underrepresented groups to come and, join the conference. And for about 3 to 5 days, we've had both versions. We kind of have modules which introduce them to various conservation ideas, successes, failures, what works, what doesn't work. Each module is curated and led by a conservation practitioner. So we have one on looking at protected area networks. What does it mean to have a protected area? We've had one on rivers, river conservation. We have different modules, and I think it's been great. Of course, it's only been 2 years since we've tried it, so we can see that there are a lot of things that we can improve. Also, what we find is that many of them do come without so much English knowledge, which means that we do provide live translation. So as the module is happening, we invite people. For example, the first year, we had someone from Nagaland. And so since I knew a little bit of Nagamese, we would actually take a break every 5 minutes and translate it into the different local languages. We had one translator for Tamil, one for Telugu. Of course, all of them crowdsourced. We just pull people from the conference saying, do you know that Tamil, come sit in this module with us. But we did try. So every year we, based on the participants, we kind of have translators sitting with us during the modules, providing live translation. It takes longer. There are challenges associated with it, right? But so much that we've learned about it. It's definitely worth it. But how can we make this better experience for them, so that they can also take something away? But while all of that works, after the pre-conference module, we invite the participants to go to the conference and sit through the talks. That's where I think they really find it hard, because suddenly they're going into this very formal setup where people come and present their formal scientific work. So I think that's a little hard, and it's hard to kind of provide translation in the main auditorium, right? You're doing kus, 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 and people around you might not appreciate it very much. So we are kind of thinking about ways to also provide support during the main conference, because otherwise then the workshops and the talks become inaccessible to them. So we have to still figure out those things. We'll see. Hopefully we'll come up with some ideas there. I mean, I'm speaking on the behalf of this pre-conference module, of course, but there have been such amazing people like Samira, Hari, Vena, Vidyadhar, Nitin, all these people who have been part of the conference, who have their own experience in also making inclusive spaces, within ecology and conservation. So we've also had a huge, amazing team of people to bank on. So yeah.
Wow. Yeah, this is potentially something that that can be adopted by other conferences and other fields as well, right?
I think it should, right? At the end of the day, it'll be nice to have everybody who contributes to that scientific process at whatever scale, whether it is at field, to come and learn about the process itself, and also to be able to see the end product. Yeah, why should it only be you and I telling each other what we find?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
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 I think an added, just to sort of take it away, but within SECS, another interesting component is the sense of community that SECS provides, right? Because
Yeah.
most ecologists or conservation or wildlife people, they end up spending a significant chunk of the year out there. It could be the field, wherever. It could be urban dump yards in Assam, or it could be some remote corner of India. All of this is done in isolation. All of the science production is in isolation, and therefore I think community is very important. But you see how people network abroad in conferences where they just go up to someone with 30-year experience and say, hey, I want to work with you. And you see the difference here, and you see how that gap still persists. Why do you think that is, and how do you think that can be remedied?
I don't know why it exists. I think that there is a certain amount of I don't know if this is cultural, right? We tend to keep teachers and whatever as people who are high up there. Again, I guess it's parallel to how science is ivory towered its way through life. So I guess we also keep famous scientists up there. We're too scared to approach them. I'm scared to approach big scientists as well. Like, I need moral boosters before I have to go talk to many people. Um, Also, maybe it comes from this place where you're feeling maybe I'm not good enough, or maybe I'm not important enough. Why will I waste their time? We have to break that thing, because all scientists always want to talk to others, right? And we are happy to. We obviously have so much to say, so we just want an outlet. So we're happy to say things. I think one thing that SSCS kind of also helped was to have these mentor-mentee dinners, where we identified people who, or we asked people who say, I'm too scared to probably approach this person on my own, but I would love to speak to them. So we do it informally as well. We announce to all the students that if there's anybody you want to talk to and you're too shy to approach, just approach any of the organizing committee members and we'll introduce you to them, right? Maybe over tea break or lunch break or whatever. But we also made it more formal, where we have these dinners where every scientist or whatever mentor is kind of made to have dinner with about 8 or 9 different people, and so they spend those 2 hours talking to each other. You're having a dinner with someone, so you get to talk to them. Everybody gets a chance, and we do this over 2 or 3 nights, so most people get a chance to be part of these dinners, and you can choose which mentor you want to have dinner with. So that's there. Then we also have this thing component called the birds of a feather. So people who say, for example, if I say I'm interested in bird ecology, then you can put up your hand and say, all people who are interested in bird ecology, why don't we just sit there and have a conversation? So it also allows for networking, and there'll be also a science, whatever, an ecologist or a conservationist who will be associated with that birds of a feather to facilitate conversations, but they're there as facilitators, right? So the idea is that students network with each other, so that they also get to know people from other places who are interested in similar things and stuff like that. Yeah.
Moving from what you said here, along the same themes of trying to bring a lot of systemic change into how things are done in this field, it also brought us to another part of your blog, which we found incredibly personal and important, which had to do with the challenges of field work, especially for women, right, in our field, because it's not as easy as it seems. It's not, it's got very different challenges from a more urban life, which is supposed to be safer, which has its own challenges, of course. But when you are in field, there are both physical and mental challenges. And on your blog, you've also given space to a very moving account by an anonymous writer who has spoken about her experiences of being sexually harassed and how it is actually so common And this, of course, was a post from several years ago, but it's not something that has changed drastically, even though we have, committees towards sexual harassment prevention in most of the big NGOs in the country. And it is, again, very systemic and perhaps even cultural to some extent. So where do you stand now, all these years after you started speaking about this on your blog?
I stand exactly where I've stood, which is that I think it is a huge problem, right? I have heard so many horrific stories over the years, and it's heartbreaking because these are your friends, these are people you work with who have had such horrible experiences. And the um, the problem is multi-folded, right? So there is the problem that you are facing harassment. The harassment can come from your own teammates or other people who are working with you. It can be a senior field member, it can be someone who's at the same, I don't know, employed in the same position as you, whatever. It can also come from people, locals or something, other people who maybe you're interacting with when you're going into the field. And what, at least from my conversations, what I was able to gather in a lot of these experiences, the thing is, we can't prevent entirely all incidences from happening, right? If there is catcalling when a person is accessing a field site, it's hard for me to prevent it from an institutional perspective, right? But I think a lot of the stories that I was hearing, unfortunately, turned out to be instances where the harassment was happening between team members, or was happening when somebody visits the other person in a supervisory role or whatever like that. And these are really, really horrible because although you have these mechanisms back in your home institute to deal with sexual harassment, you don't know how to access these mechanisms. So in at least now, every institute, I think, has to have like a sexual harassment committee, and there are rules laid out and people are made aware of this thing. 10 years ago, that wasn't the case, right? So I know of cases where women were harassed continuously in field. They didn't know what to do. And women tend to do this thing where you're trying to constantly question yourself and say, maybe it wasn't harassment, maybe I'm overthinking this, maybe they didn't mean it, maybe they were being innocent. That's not fair, right? If you're being harassed and then you have to then go on and use a reasoning to say, no, maybe I'm just overreacting, also comes from a place where um, both the victim and the perpetrator doesn't know what is sexual harassment, right? So at that time, I think um, based on all these stories and based on, I think, experiences that also we all face in field, when I eventually had an opportunity to have other people work for me as part of my field teams, what I would do was to basically, I had my own field sexual harassment guidelines, like where I would make people read what is sexual harassment, and this was based off of um, um, I don't know what do you call guidelines that other institutes had put together. And I think it helps, right? You make sure that everybody who's going into field reads it, understands it, right? Acknowledges that they have read it, means that they're aware of what is sexual harassment, what can be construed as sexual harassment, and what the consequences are of engaging in such behavior. Yeah. The other important thing is, in many of these cases that I've heard about, although even if the victim knows that they were they were sexually harassed, sometimes they don't know what to do with that information. Who do I contact, right? You have to make that absolutely clear. So I think it's not enough to have a sexual harassment committee and to have some guidelines put up on a website. You have to ensure that field teams read it, they're aware of it, that they know who to contact at any given point of time. And if you can't contact that person, here's the number to the alternate person, right? If you feel threatened, get out of field. You don't have to continue working, just go to the nearest town, come home. That's fine, right? To say it's okay to remove yourself from that space is also okay. And the other thing is also not questioning and saying, are you sure? I have had a friend tell me this example, like after many, many weeks of harassment, she gathered the courage to tell her supervisor. She wasn't sure who she was supposed to tell to. So she just called up whoever was her immediate supervisor, and their response was, are you sure? That is not nice, right? So we also have to train each other in how to respond, right? give them the support they need at the time. Ask them to come back if they feel threatened. Help them lodge a formal complaint if required. Let the committee do its job. You're not the committee, right? It's not your place to question or to doubt what they're going through. So I think these are, they seem so silly, but they're so important and we kind of overlook them. So I think, in answer to your question, I think it is still a pervasive problem. I still hear stories of horrible experiences that people have in field. A lot of it that comes from team members, but there are ways, small steps can help us, I guess, make it safer.
Yeah, no, like you're saying, these aren't silly things, they're so important. And the tiniest bit of, like even a reaction, like asking a victim if they are sure that, they're not just believing something. I mean, it can undo so many days or even months of gradually building up the self-confidence to do something about a situation.
It
I
also
think
puts
that's,
doubt, right? Like you're then thinking, oh, if this is not sexual harassment, the next time you face it, you'll think maybe it wasn't. You're constantly eroding their belief in their own ability to determine whether they were feeling harassed or not.
Yeah.
Also to tell people, sorry, go on.
No, go ahead.
No, I was saying that I've also had instances where it's really sad because the person who reached out said that they were feeling like it was uncomfortable for them, but other people were saying, nothing's there, she's just overthinking it. So another thing to remember is that it doesn't matter the intention or what other people think, right? Whether or not objectively you can put a line and say this is sexual harassment or not, what matters at that point is also what you're feeling. Right? If you are feeling like you're being harassed, then I have to value your feeling. At the end of the day, that perception matters.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think it's not just the fact that it happens, but the responses that we have to it. And the lack of a good support system or the knowledge of that can just leave so much of this dormant. And I think, while I can say I'm fortunate to have not faced something too untoward, I've definitely seen this in small quantities as somebody who's still very early in her career in this field. And, you can only imagine how much more there is to come. So it's good to have some of these things in place. And I think it's very good best practices, like you were saying, to not just have these policies in place at the organization, but to bring them into the field and share it with every new person you bring on, even for local help. I think that's definitely very good advice. And I think even beyond, the physical challenges that have to do with harassment, I think another thing we face in our field is a lot of sexism, where it's still a young field in India, especially. And, we still have a lot of macho conservationists who feel that that field is not a place for women. And I certainly have experienced some sexism, and I'm sure you have heard stories and have come across that as well. I mean, what do you think we could do to fix this issue? I feel like that's, so much more subtle and more everyday, when you get out there.
You're definitely right. Sexism is just, how do you combat it, right? It's just, I get thousands of years of bias that just filters through every second. I think calling them out on bad behavior, but the problem is this: often the power hierarchy is not in your favor, right? Whoever is kind of putting you down, or who you're facing the sexism from, will turn out to be someone who's senior to you. And we still, unfortunately, that power dynamics play such a big role, right? It's not easy, but we have to empower people enough to call them out and make them feel safe when they call out, right? And I think the Me Too movement kind of tried doing that, where people called out. And that's the funniest thing, right? We all know sexism happens. We all know it's very subtle sometimes that you're like, wait, what? Like, what did you say? And sometimes it's only much later you're like, wait a minute, I think that was sexist. So I guess, and we all have these whisper networks, even for like, forget sexual harassment, even for these things, we kind of know, stay away from him. He's always like, we have these things that we tell each other. I think it's good to call people out. It's not easy, especially if you're early career, young, but I don't have any more to offer. Yeah, I don't know. I think I would not have called out when I was young, but now, I guess because I don't think of it that way, but I have to constantly remind myself that I'm no longer a student. And technically, my position comes with some amount of authority, right? Whether I like it or not. And I guess maybe that gives me a little bit more confidence to call out bad behavior. But I do. And I think the other thing is also for people like me to stand up for other people, especially if they are not in a position of power, and call out on their behalf, right? I think that's very important, and we have to be allies of each other, right? It's not possible, yeah, one person to keep calling out, and we have to build that level of, I guess, support.
Absolutely, and I think all of these are like notes, especially the field sexual harassment guidelines that you mentioned is so important, and I don't know anyone else who does it, at least in our limited circles, right? And I think it'll be great if that can be out in the public domain, like some open source.
I can check. I wanted to put it up on my webpage, my faculty webpage, but I thought about it a lot. I don't mind putting it up, but what I usually do is to email it to anybody who's hired on my team before they go to field, and they have to acknowledge that they've read it and they've understood it. Yeah, I'm happy to share it, and I think it's not. I think many organizations are really putting a lot of thought. Many conservation NGOs, whatever, are really putting thought into this. So it's not just me, but yeah, I guess I of course come from an institute that has its own posh. But what I do is to essentially take that and give it to people and say, you have to read this, and these are the people you can contact, right? If you face any harassment, and it has everything. It says, if you face harassment from a team member, you can inform me. If you feel like you're facing harassment from me, here is who you can inform against me. If you feel like that person is harassing you, then so there's a chain of alternatives that they can kind of, and I'm assuming that one of them is that they can contact. It's not as dire that they can't reach out to anybody. So
Yeah, I think the other very important thing you mentioned, which I personally have noticed, is there is that whisper network of identifying people who have this really bad behavior. But and it's not just the power structures, right? It's like it's basically bystander effect. Someone else is going to bell the cat. And it's so horrifying when you see that same person who has told you how horrible this other person is, when they meet, say, some young kid from at SECS doe-eyed and asks about this potentially sexist and God knows what person, you give a glowing recommendation because it's not in your place. And I think the distinction between bitching about someone and speaking facts about this bad behavior is very different. And I don't know how one would navigate that.
Yeah, so I guess we're torn between this professional courtesy that we have to show, and we have to be like, I don't want to untowardly spoil his. I don't know. I mean, the truth is the truth, right? I mean, we can still say that, he's an excellent researcher. He's done this amazing work. He is path-breaking work on maybe liana structure in tropical forests. But at the same time, he can be sexist. They're not mutually exclusive. You can be a sexist and you can be someone who is excellent at coding in R. And I think we should give students that full information so they can decide for themselves, right? I mean, that they know what they're getting into if they do want to get into it. If it were me, I would be like, please, you can learn coding from other people also. Because mental health and peace and safety is so much more important than being, I guess, associated with famous people. But that's just me. Everybody has their own preferences, but at least that information should be available to them.
Yeah, I think, this also very nicely brings us to talking to you about how you've been mentoring so many students ever since you became faculty at Azim Premji. And I think, how long have you been faculty there right now?
I think in April it'll be 2 years. So not so long also. Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, what has that been like for you? I mean, did you very organically come into this role because of some of the things you were doing, or, what's it like to be a teacher? You were just telling us how you still have to remind yourself that you're not a student anymore.
Yeah. I think I still exist in a mind space where I think of myself as a researcher or like, like a PhD student or a postdoc. And sometimes I have to tell myself, oh, wait, in the classroom, sometimes I'm like, what shall we do? And then I'm like, shit, wait, I have to take that decision. Like how much ever I want my classes to be democratic, at some point I have to take a decision. And I'm sometimes I find myself very shocked by this. What? I have to take a decision, seriously? But it was not. I've always been fond of teaching. I knew that. I think, and this is not recent. I think I remember I used to catch hold of my father's friends and my uncle's friends and teach them when I was a young child, right? Captive audience. And I guess it was also coming back to what I said about myself. If I learn something new that has changed the way I look at something, I want to share it with someone. So I guess I used to catch people and tell them these things. But prior to joining APU, I think I have always interacted with either PhD students or master students, and I had experience mentoring them. And I assumed mentoring undergraduate students would be an extension of that, right? How different can it be? But it is very different. And I think I did feel a bit like, I don't know what I was doing the first few months. Like, I felt I knew what I was doing, but at the same time, I felt I didn't know what I was doing. Um, Not because I think undergrads are amazing, right? Because they are energetic. They're It's very unfair to say this, but for a lot of them, it's like a clean slate, right? They don't yet have the biases that maybe people have, because they maybe when we read, when we learn, we all become biased in our own ways. They are so much more energetic. They're enthusiastic to learn. So there's a lot of fun things there's a lot of energy around them that you also feel like, oh, and they're optimistic. Here you are jaded thinking this is it, the world is going to just go to the dogs, and here are these people saying, what, let's make a change, we can do something about it. So it's very, very nice to be around such people who, we were all that, right? That energy of the youth where you think change is possible. So it's nice to be around them. um, but I think I struggled a bit in trying to kind of go from that mentality of having mentored masters and PhD students to thinking about undergrads, because while they are all that, they also come from, many of them, especially in India, you finish your 12th, you know how 12th exams are, right? Your whole life in your 11th and 12th is about getting some marks and cracking those exams. So I think in a way, they're also scared to question, they are scared to kind of explore, to speculate. So it's fun to kind of get them to, I'm constantly asking why. And they're like, what do you mean why? So if I say, okay, what is this? They'll be like, it's a plant that has a leaf. Why? And they're like, what do you mean why? And they're very scared to speculate, because you think science is not about speculation. You've been told all your life, you put your hand up only if you know the answer. And here I am in my class saying, put your hand up. It's okay to speculate, right? I'll ask you a question. Why do you think the flower needs the bee to pollinate? If they don't know the answer, they're just sitting. I'm like, no, it's okay. You can guess. It's okay to guess as long as there's logical reasoning to your guessing. So I guess it took me a while, but now I feel like little bit I have learned. There's a long way to go, but yeah.
Yeah, I think your teaching pedagogy reflects almost maps onto your academic trajectory, if I must. So I think for our listeners, here's your academic journey in brief, right? You started off by studying the dengue virus in human patients, and then you published a lot on why animals and birds are found where they are, going back in time through genetic tools. That was for your PhD, and then for your postdoc, moved into looking at satellite imagery of forests and grasslands to understand where one is and how one can turn into the other. And while doing all of this, you had some very, very interesting side projects where you looked at how birds see, how birds that are very similar to each other hear each other. And you even have a recent paper from this year on why COVID mutations make them spread faster, right? So it's one thing to be widely curious, which clearly our listeners now know you are. is very inspiring. But it's quite another to take each of those curiosity projects to its, to a deep intellectual foray. So, what's your secret sauce?
No, I must say here that I mean, like everything in our lives, I'm also a work in progress. And like most other people, I also have a lot of interests, right? I'm someone who gets very excited by anything that I'm learning new. I'm very excitable that way. Um, I must say that both the dengue and the SARS-CoV papers, my contribution has been very specific. I actually wasn't sure if I should even be an author on it because I have technical skills, right? All of us learn these technical skills during our PhDs, which kind of then other people might not have and they might use it. For example, for both the dengue paper and the SARS-CoV, I think it's because I helped build a phylogeny or helped interpret the phylogeny. Because I learned how to build phylogenies as part of my PhD work. So it's not really so much of a interest as much as I was able to contribute a specific skill set to that. And I think that's okay, right? I mean, that's the whole point. You as a scientist, we are both thinkers and people who are able to kind of think about the bigger picture, but we also come with specific skill sets that we can kind of employ in various questions, I guess. But again, I'll say this is this is my explanation that ecosystems are complex systems. They're connected, right? There's value in fixing on one thing and studying only one topic for many years. I'm not saying there isn't value in that. There is a lot of value in that. And just because I'm doing 2-3 different things doesn't mean that I'm not doing the latter, right? You can have 2 or 3 different interests, but you can still engage with them in a very deep way. But at the same time, I like to, at this point, think about Darwin. He was a geologist, he was a biologist, he was a naturalist, right? Many of those people who kind of gave us these phenomenal theories, which kind of changed our worldview, were people who could look integratively at many fields and kind of pull these ideas from different fields and make these theories. I personally think that it's important, while expertise is very important, it's also important to read about these things, right? I can't just study one insect and forget that that insect lives in some sort of an ecosystem in interactions with other organisms around it. So for me, that's going to be the explanation I give to why I have so many interests also. Because when you're learning something, when you're reading something, you start to think about other things, right? That's how the switch happened to me going from PhD to postdoc. I was doing field work in the Northeast trapping rodents. But the more I trapped rodents, the more I traveled in the Northeast, the more I thought about the forests in which I was doing this, right? And the more I became interested in how do forests, how are they resilient? How are they managing to survive? Because if you were to only read the paper, you'll think everything should have died by now, but they aren't. Things are surviving, right? And so you also know that while forests are resilient, you also know that while we often think of human influence as being so negative and so destructive, you also see examples of communities that have these amazing relationships with their environment, that over years have allowed these forests to persist in some way. That forests are not pristine things. They've always had humans in them. Like, I think a lot of these things kind of, I started seeing things differently. And so the next natural question was, okay, I understand something about the rodent community, but here's the landscape in which the rodent lives. So that felt natural to me. Yeah. And so although I did do a lot of things in the past, now I focus largely on forest resilience, forest second succession, things like how do forests change. But I'm also interested in avian frugivores, for instance. Because it might look like, oh, you're also working on birds, but I'm specifically interested in avian frugivores because they're important for the forests, right? They do seed dispersal. So in my head, there is some connection, and I feel like it's natural because it's how the train of my thought is. Like, I'm thinking of one thing and I'm saying, hey, if I have to understand this, I have to understand that. But when you start something, you have so many different ideas that come, and you start publishing here and there because there's some interesting things that you've observed. So yeah.
Yeah, this is fascinating.
Yeah.
And definitely inspiring for us who are slowly getting into our silos and thinking that you cannot go beyond it. Clearly can.
No, I mean, at the same time, like, for instance, I feel like I still don't know. I mean, all of us feel this, but I specifically feel that I so much that there is to do and learn and to understand, right? So it's not easy to do this and that and to have expertise in everything. But I guess that doesn't mean, just because you can't be an expert on both this and that and that and that, that doesn't mean that you then silo yourself and ignore everything else that's happening around, right? Because again, it's an ecological system. If you pull one thread, another thread will move. If you're only going to focus on one thread, you're missing out on the fact that it's a tapestry, it's a whole weave, right? So I think occasionally, even if we don't do research on all 3 or 4 threads, sometimes taking a step back and saying, where is my thread connected to? I think that's important.
Yeah, and I was just curious about the other side of this, right? So here is the within science community sort of an approach. But say you're talking to someone during a PhD, you were trapping rodents. So how was it trying to explain to people, hey, what do you do for a living? I go and catch rats in remote forests, and then yeah.
I think the funniest thing reactions I've had are from communities there. So I remember once I was trapping, I don't know if it was in Meghalaya or Nagaland, and then they were like, "आपके यहाँ में चूहा नहीं है क्या? Like, you don't have rats in your place, that you came all the way here to catch rats? Like, what's special about our rats?" Right? And it's quite hilarious to try and justify rodent trapping to a lot of people. But I guess again, that's where you kind of build in the bigger picture, right? You talk about how, biogeography, da 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 da, you give all these stories, and then you say rodents are just a study system, right? Technically, the questions that I'm answering, I could have answered with any other group of species as well, but I'm choosing rodents because they're hyper diverse or whatever. So, yeah. I also, for many years during my PhD, was the official on-call person if someone had rats in their house, which kind of annoyed me after a while. So people would call and say, "Hey, there's a rat in my room," and I'd be like, "What am I supposed to do? I'm not like," yeah. But anyway.
Yeah, no, I think it's really funny that, when you start to look at what we do from the perspective of people who just live there locally and they're so used to these creatures around. I remember even when I went to look at the monkeys at Nicobar, and for them, they're just bandar in their backyard, some pests eating their coconut. And they were like, why have you come from nice mainland India to look at bandar?
Yeah.
What is wrong with you?
Yeah. And that's actually kind of, it's funny, right? But it's also nice. I think that's a nice hook to kind of start talking to people about, I don't know, I guess, whatever it is that you're interested in.
Yeah. No, I think, and another thing that really stood out for me was you just describing ecosystems as a, large tapestry of, so many things. And it gives me also a lot of hope, actually, because, I feel very existential about, doing a little bit of a lot or a lot of just one thing. And it's so hard to decide for yourself what that personal trade-off should be and which way you choose to do. But it's also very encouraging to know that you can actually pull at multiple threads significantly enough to know what's going on and to not be lost about the larger scheme of things. And I think it's nice that I'm sure even a lot of your undergrad students benefit from knowing that from an early stage rather than something that comes in much later as a sudden realization when you're already so deep into just one silo, like Akshay was saying. Yeah. So, I mean, you've worked on extensively building this academic knowledge on a wide range of topics. But I mean, as you were talking, you've also invested so much in science communication and citizen science, and you even talk a lot about your personal experiences on social media or even on your blog. So, how do you do the more popular side of your work? Is that more for yourself, or is that coming from a sense of responsibility as a researcher?
I think both, but the responsibility, I think, like I explained before, comes also from what science is, right? As a gated ivory tower, I feel like as a person, I can't necessarily break down those compound walls all the time. Maybe I'll be arrested for breaking compound walls also. But one thing I can do is to allow leakage outside, right? I don't know. I feel like I actually do a lot of it because I like writing, or I like I said, shaking people and saying, "Oh my God, this is something I learned today." Like for instance, yesterday, and I was so excited. I told 100 people about it. I didn't know that shikakai is actually acacia, and that it's a climber. Right? Look at me. And I used shikakai in my life. I used it like even last year. And I didn't know that it came. And I was mind blown because I went for a walk and I saw this plant and I identified it. And it said acacia. And then there was a farmer on whose land this tree was. And he said, "Ha, there, you can see the shikakai." It was so, like for him, he was amazed as why I was excited by shikakai plant. That was apparently planted by his grandfather or great grandfather or something. So yeah, so, and I think I told 100 people yesterday. I called people and said, "Oh my God, did you know this?" So I do some of it because I get excited and I like to share my excitement. But at the same time, I also feel that at the end of the day, we all need scientific temper, right? That's very important. This current ecosystem we find ourselves with, alternative news and alternative facts and all this thing, also comes because we don't know how to distinguish fact from fiction. We don't know how to distinguish opinion from fact. um, so kind of I think sharing the process of how we do things, or sharing interesting findings, is one way of also helping people understand the role of evidence, or how are we drawing these conclusions. That's something I don't think I've done enough of it yet, but that's something that I would like to do. And yeah, I don't know if all of us writing, all of us sharing our experiences also allows people to think that this is something I can do, right? Then good, right? We need more diverse communities in our science. Um, so
Yeah, absolutely. And before I forget, I remembered just when you told me shikakai, the acacia fact, I found this really interesting pattern when I was working in Valparai. The Kadar community there routinely extracts shikakai from the forests. And they speak of a boom bust cycle in shikakai, like a superannual fruiting burst, which is
oh,
fascinating. Yeah, yeah. And
I was just, this is so interesting. Just last week, I think I was trying to, so I'm teaching a course which kind of, first 3 weeks we talk about microbes, then the next 3 or 4 weeks we talk about plants, then we talk about birds and insects. So it's kind of gives students an introduction to organisms that are found within ecosystems,
Mhm.
and the interconnectedness between symbiosis and stuff like that. So while I was, I don't know why we're going down this road anyway. So while I was so I had spoken about the acorn masting cycle, and while doing that, I realized that even our dipterocarps show masting, right? Many dipterocarps show this masting. So I was trying to give them an example because I feel like, don't give temperate examples, give examples from Asia, like that. While I was reading, I came across a paper which kind of said that masting is this kind of coordinated, synchronized fruiting flowering is also very common in many tropical plants. Although we don't know exactly why, because it would seem that it makes sense in the temperate region because of resources and predation and stuff. But apparently it also makes sense in tropical regions. I didn't know this. Yeah, I was so impressed. Like, yeah. And how figs are the figs kind of take, like I also then presented them what figs do, right? They have this asynchrony, which means that while other plants might have these boom and bust, figs are just like these plodding away. Anytime in the forest you have some fig tree fruiting somewhere. It's amazing. Yeah, anyway, I was so thrilled.
And I think here's the other thing that links to one question that I have, which is it's so easy potentially to collaborate with someone who is fundamentally curious about science. But in India, in the ecology circles, it's so limited that having collaborations means making a lot of compromises, working with people with different approaches and different motivations for science. And you clearly have collaborated with a lot of people, and you've seen others. So how do you think you can have a healthy collaborative atmosphere which benefits your personal goals while still advancing science?
Mm, so I think one thing about me is that I'm very curious, right? I personally don't do things because I feel like this is good for my career. I do things because I'm interested. So, for example, I think right now I'm helping an undergraduate student who worked on spiders. do some morphometric analysis because I know how to do the morphometric analysis. And when I saw his results and his data, I was like, oh my God, this is so interesting. I want to know, right? I'm so curious to know what this will happen if we did this. And I'm willing to give you whatever skill set that I have if you can figure it out. Actually, I'm very happy to have ideas and have other people work on them. I just want to know the answers. But so I think for me, what has worked, I guess, is that I've been really fortunate to have worked with some really patient and kind people who also are coming possibly from a space of curiosity, not necessarily just I have to do this because it's important for my career advancement. And I think we all also develop these filters, right? We know who might potentially turn out to be a good collaborator, who wouldn't, based on these common shared goals. And so I guess there are situations where you're like, great, I can help you, but I don't think this is a long-term collaboration. I'm happy to help people, right? I can help you with analysis, whatever, but I'm not sure if this is something that I can do permanently. So I guess we all have our own filters. But I think making a collaboration work would mean that you have to constantly go back to that common shared curiosity, right? If you get stuck on this is more important for my career versus your career versus I want to do this because I think then you kind of lose the plot. If it's rooted in the shared curiosity about the world, I think then it sounds so idealistic when I'm saying it, but honestly, I think because then even if there are positions where you disagree on something, right? Where you're saying, I don't think we should do this versus I think we should put this in the manuscript. And there's been instances like this where I've said that, we've done the analysis, but I don't think it should be part of the manuscript because I don't know how to interpret this. And the other person is saying, no, but it makes sense. But to constantly go back and say, it helps you kind of mitigate these potentially confrontational situations, but also to say if it is your manuscript, it's also their manuscript, right? If it is not incorrect, right, and if it's okay to have it, don't just block something because it's difficult for us to, we have to save face and we can't like now say, okay, fine, do what you want because we feel like it hurts our ego. I think that's the other thing, to just be like, fine, if you want it, have it, as long as you're okay with it, right? It's not detrimental to you or your paper, or it's not saying something wrong. And that we have to do it for ourselves. Like, it's okay. You don't have to have your way every time.
Yeah,
I mean, of course, if it is, but if it is something that you strongly believe shouldn't be, either for ethical reasons or whatever, I think you should also put your foot down and explain to they're also people, right? They're not idiots. So explain to them why you think something should or shouldn't be, and trust in them that they will listen, that they are not idiots, that they also will see reason, right? I think that's also important. Sorry, I'm done.
No, this is absolutely, yeah. I think definitely I'm going to carry this forward in our early careers. All of us would, I'm sure. I think we're sort of coming to the end, and we were curious what your future plans are, right? So you've now moved into a largely academic space, but you're in a supporting research role for your undergrads, and I'm guessing mentoring undergrads will take a lot more time than, say, mentoring some PhD or postdoc or sorry, master's student. So, how do you see yourself splitting your time going forward and your contribution to the community outside of academia as well?
I think in terms of how I look at myself, nothing, except that I now teach one undergraduate course per semester, nothing really has changed. A lot of, in the sense that I continue to do my research. Of course, it's not the same to the extent that I would do if I were in an only research institute, right? Because teaching does take up a lot of time, preparing for classes, mentoring undergrads takes up a lot of time. But I do continue to do research, which I think is important because it keeps you motivated and sharp, I guess. I don't know if I'm sharp, but yeah. Otherwise, it becomes boring, right? If you have to only teach. So I do my research. And fortunately, because our undergrads also have this honors track, they also have to do research projects, which means that they also contribute to your research. It takes they require a lot more mentoring, but it's fun because again, like I said, they don't necessarily come with a lot of preconceived ideas about things. So when you're presenting a project idea or a project that is already running in your research career, they're able to come in and kind of look at it with fresh eyes, right? And they ask you questions which you are thinking, oh, wait, I didn't think of it. So maybe we can focus on that. So I think that way, working with undergrads is really, it's been fun for me, and also when their mind gets blown, it's an amazing time to be around them because they are like, whoa, and yeah, it's very satisfying. So yeah, so I teach, I do research, and I don't see why it will stop me from continuing to, it does impact the frequency with which you probably will do science communication or something, but we still do it.
Yeah, no, thanks, yeah, Priya, for this. I mean, I'm feeling really energized after, this chat with you, because it's nice to see someone who's so enthused by the natural world and by everything that she's doing and everything that's happening. And yeah, I think it just gives you a lot of hope to keep trying new stuff and to allow yourself to get lost in certain newer fields every now and again. Yeah, no, this has been such a fun chat.
Yeah,
Thanks
thank
so
you.
much for
Yeah,
talking to us and sharing all of this.
thank you. It's a great pleasure to talk to both of you, and I think I've had fun as well. So
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, this has
thank
been
you.
great. Yeah.
Yeah.
We had a great time recording this episode. We hope you enjoyed it too. Thanks for listening.